This is Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Here are your hosts, Dr. Tim Slekar and Dr. Johnny Lupinacci, educated educators talking education.
Of course it is. Tim and Johnny, Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Educated educators talking education. Right off the bat, 855-752-4842. Want to make sure we give you that number. Johnny Lupinacci, you know what I was thinking about right away tonight? If I had a beer, and if I wanted to have a beer, I would have it to Minocqua Brewery. You know why? There it is. Because Busted Pencils is sponsored by the Minocqua Brewing Company, who sued the state of Wisconsin to end its parasitic voucher system that hurts public schools. Minocqua Brewing Company is making Wisconsin great again, one beer at a time. Check out MinocquaBrewingCompany.com to see where you can buy their progressive beer. And man, right into it, though, I see our guests love that little promo right there. You know what? But before we do, though, we've got a great guest, and we're going to be talking about what Johnny and I always really, the heart of democracy, public education, that word public. We're going to talk about that. Johnny Lupinacci, though, I just want to tell, great show last night. Dr. Nancy Carlson Page, just want to point out there, came in, talked about 3Qing,
taught us about it.
Taught us a lot about the 3Qing system, about reading, and I put some of that stuff online for the Busted Pencils listeners, Twitter feed, Facebook feed. And there's a little bit of a controversy that Dr. Nancy Carlson Page stirred up, because according to the Science of Reading people that follow us on Twitter, and thank you, or X, for following us. We want you to keep following us on Twitter. Nancy Carlson Page was bringing up something that they had thought they had killed and had put to death finally. And how dare Dr. Nancy Carlson Page, Matt Damon's mom, bring up the potential that the 3Qing system might actually be of some use for helping kids learn to read. So again, love that out there. Have a great conversation. In fact, highlighting the how do we talk about these things? Our guest, though, he's began his career as a middle school and high school teacher in South Africa right after the end of apartheid. He is a nationally recognized education leader and author of the groundbreaking book Publicization, as Johnny says. He has served as an official at the New York City Department of Education, and is president and co-founder of the Association of College and University Educators. Welcome to Busted Pencils, Jonathan Gurko. How are you, our friend?
Tim, Johnny, thank you so much for having me on the show. I love your style. I had an extra cup of coffee today so I could keep up. And I love how you are bringing progressive politics, progressive points of view to our critical work of schools in America.
Yeah. So, John, let's jump right into it, though, too. I mean, title of your book right off the bat, Publicization. I've been practicing saying that because yesterday it wasn't. I'm getting there. Publicization. Jonathan, publicization. Come on, start off right away. Give us, what do you mean? What's the title? What are we talking about here? Publicization.
Yeah. Well, what's the opposite of privatization? Crickets. You need a word. We need a word. And I think the word is publicization, right? Like the old political adage goes, you can't beat something with nothing. You can't beat somebody with nobody. And so I wrote Publicization to put together a lot of ideas, old and new, about what a new paradigm, a new agenda for the future of schools in America might look like.
When you say that, too, it's just this idea to public schools. Do we need then a redefinition to put this forward, as you just said? Because public schools, I think about, we talk about people in the community, we take for granted public schools, I think, in this point, and kind of forget that there are neighborhood schools and public, and this whole concept of public. And what does public mean? Was that pushing some of the things that Jonathan was thinking about doing in this book?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, I think the word public and the expression public schools is like a Rorschach test.
Yeah.
you read into it what you want, and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I experienced that firsthand when I came back from South Africa. I was there in the extraordinary years, 95 to 98. Mandela had just been elected. We were doing amazing things, bringing progressive quality schooling to students who, frankly, had never had it. Came back to New York and kind of fell into the charter school movement. Not out of any right-wing neoliberal markets competition, but it was interesting. There was a lot of energy around it. And, at the time, people would say, oh, charter schools, we're public schools. Oh, no, you're not. Yes, we are. No, you're not. And I use a line in the book. I mean, it was kind of like rock'em sock'em robots beating each other up and just as boring. And I thought, well, what does this mean? What does it mean to be a public school? And that fight is still going on through advocates of district schools and defenders of charter schools. And I don't think the fight is doing anybody good. It means we are a divided house in tax-funded education, and that's not going to take us forward.
Think about the way he just said that, Johnny. Tax-funded education. I'm looking at you, John, for a little, connection there. I see your eyes going back and forth.
Well, yeah, I think this is great conversation to have. Jonathan, thank you for your work. Thanks for being a guest on the show tonight, and to teach here tonight for listener out there who's hearing this I think really brilliant use of language. We start with, we have all this conversation about privatization, and it's created this house divided, this rock'em sock'em robots. You're either, for privatization or against it. But how it plays out is we have this, like you said, charter versus public school. And I think, like, especially as reading your book and, thinking through, we'll get to that piece because you really propose some rethinking and I think a nice way of reframing that moves us away from the blow for blow, rock'em sock'ems to where do we go from here, right? And so we could get into that. But I love this for our listener, and it's a sad day for us to have to do this, but it's not to talk down to anybody. It's sort of to clarify. And I actually have to do this regularly myself when I'm teaching the landscape of education. And by public, starting back, like, what does it even mean to be a public school or have something be part of a public institution or a public good? Jonathan, for our listener, like, how could you give a 101? What constitutes something as public?
Yeah. So super fast, rather than defining it by the kind of institution, right? This is a government thing, which is often used in a pejorative way. That's no helpful.
Yeah.
The book uses a very classical definition. You want me to go now, or you want me to hold?
Yeah. No,
okay, let's do it.
Let it rip.
So in economics, it's a very simple idea. If you can exclude something from somebody else, it's a private good.
Yeah.
Right? Think of an apple. If I eat this apple and I don't share it, that's my private apple, my private lunch. If I can't exclude something like the air we breathe, that's a public good. And the book, readers will find, develops that into this notion of an exclusion test. Where we can find exclusion in schooling, parents, students, families being kept from something, it's a little less public than it could be. And that's an opportunity to strengthen the publicness of something. So super quick example, think of attendance zones. If I live on this side of a street and I have to go to that district school instead of this other district school, I'm excluded from that other district school by a line on a map. That feels like an expression of privateness and an opportunity for us to make schools and attendance and where you go a little more public.
I like that, the way you put that there, the difference there, the private though too, the idea. Yeah, this is my apple. However, the air we're sharing it something in common. if you're out there too, and you have a definition of public schools, give us a call, talk to our guest right now, 855-752-4842. What does public school mean to you out there? Tom from New Berlin out there sending some love over a text. Thanks, Tom. Love to see that. But yeah, this idea of public education, our guest, Jonathan Gerko, his new book, Publicization, is exploring this concept, and how many people have thought deeply to say, oh, I know what public schools are. I know what that means. And Jonathan, I think what you just ended with potentially is even a little bit kind of going like, oh, wait. So you mean my district public school, because I exclude the district on the other side of the line, my district public school might not be totally public.
Well, that's right. And the book takes this exclusion test and it applies it to 6 major domains, what I think are what makes for schools, school operation. Funding, the underlying philosophy, how schools are governed, the standards we're trying to meet and how we test against them. Accountability is the 5th, and equity is the 6th. And readers will find in the book, when you start looking for exclusiveness in those 6 areas, my goodness, there's a whole lot of opportunity to make schools more public, both district and charter. And in some cases, we can learn from the charter school sector, which in some ways is more public than district schools.
I could see that raising a couple eyebrows and some hackles out there. Our guest is Jonathan Gerko. His new book, Publicization, is out. He's talking to us right now, giving us some truth about this. The idea here, though, too, if you want to jump in, if you have a definition of public school, and you potentially are saying, like, I don't necessarily agree with that, give us a call, 855-752-4842, because, one of the things we do want to do on Busted Pencils, when we say bust pencils, we mean we like to do that together, break them up, tear them apart, have discussion, potentially even sometimes disagree, but then also, hey, do what it is that we do best, which is educate everybody. Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. When we get back, though, Jonathan, I want to know more about charter schools, charter school definition, public schools, more on Busted Pencils. So, Johnny,
yeah,
you got in that next equitable. Let's get into the way you recommend what we think. Oh, okay, we kind of started hitting that, right? But you want to do that deeper?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really compelling about the presentation, like kind of the definition that Jonathan laid out with public, and then kind of how I took us up to the break with, like, sometimes public is not reserved only for traditionally what public schools mean. There's a concept here, what it means to be accessible, right, and available and free at the point of access, right? And so there's this sort of, in the rock'em sock'em like debate, there's this strict dividing. You're either charter and you're private, or you're public and you're public. And this isn't true. There's more of a, and I always mix the words up. So I was just looking up, I believe it's called like a typology. There's different types of schools in our community. There didn't used to be. There used to be traditionally a private school and a public school. But here, I'll introduce that and we'll come back.
Yeah. Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk, educated educators talking education. Our guest, Jonathan Gerko, his new book, Publicization, talking more about it, definitions. Johnny Lupinacci, during the break, you and I were, we were talking about that. You had a question for Jonathan. I'm just going to let you go with it, man.
Well, yeah. And I like what we're talking about here, Tim. And Jonathan took us up into that the last break there in a really, I think, a really honest moment. that you said, like maybe some people might disagree with, but I think it's a real important one. When we start to think about what it means to be a public school can mean different things. We could take it as the label of our traditional sort of historical knowledge that, as far back as we can remember, there's private schools. There's often reserved, for the elite or, the wealthy. There's a tuition sort of system, and there's private education and there's public schools. And by and large, mostly historically, we understand public schools as our neighborhood schools, right? Our local school system, and where you live kind of pointed to where you would go learn. And we know that has still, by and large, some implications about like social class and racial divides in our country. It certainly isn't as simple as to say, well, we just need, strong public schools everywhere. We need a lot of work on like zoning and a lot of different things to address free and quality at the point of access. And, Jonathan took us up to that messiness that a lot of states are pretty far and deep into at this point, where the landscape of free at the point of access has changed. And there's a sort of need. I've always been kind of, looking for this. And I think Jonathan's book, Publicization, is a great start and companion to this conversation. In a sense, what is like a typology, almost like a legend on a map to give us a key for understanding where our kids, when I say our kids, just children in our community, can go to school, where we educate the future citizens of this country. It's not as simple as the history it used to be, where it's like, oh, private school, you want to enroll, maybe they take a test to get into it, or you pay a lot of money and they go to this private school, or they go to the local neighborhood school. Well, school choices and different things started to change that landscape. Flash forward into charters, right? And I think some of the myth of the debate is charters are private schools and public schools are public schools. And there is some truth to that, as in the book, Jonathan lays out, privatization of things, but flips it and talks about what about the publicization. So I think it's really insightful and it's honest. And sometimes it takes us being open-minded about those sides that we're often on. But thinking about like a typology, there's different types of schools. And kind of, Jonathan, can I ask you just for our listener, I think we've shared it a little bit, but I think clearly, like you lay it out in the book, but you're inviting folks to sort of unify around, let's understand what the choices are, not advocating that there should be choice, because that school choice thing is reserved for sort of the argument for privatization. When we start talking about public school on the ground, parent out there in the community who's seeing the billboards, just looking at the schools, driving by, and now there's like this market for like where to choose to go to school, which kind of by and large part of a larger problem. But some of our charter schools are public by the definition of being free at the point of access. Can you give us a little brief typology? I hate even using that word. I know what to call it. Like, give us a legend to the key of what we mean by like it's a little more complicated than just private versus public.
Johnny, you've put a lot of strands on the table. I'll try to weave them together. This is a colorful tapestry here. I like to think about it less as a typology, types of schools, and take the pragmatic in the conventional sense and the philosophically pragmatic definition of let's judge something by the outcomes, right? So if a school doesn't exclude, right? No admissions test, which is a form of exclusion, and no tuition, even with scholarships, which can be a form of exclusion. And if you add to the exclusion test the classic historical goals of schooling, of preparing citizens, productive workers, good neighbors, and I think we've got to add a fourth public good, stewards of our planet. So if a school is doing those four things, producing public goods and not excluding, I'm hard pressed to see how that's not a public education. And I'm prepared to look at a charter school, a district school, a proprietary school, a nonprofit private school, and judge it against those outcomes and the exclusion test to say, are they delivering a public education?
Mm-hmm.
And, in the case of charters, look, it is a lot older than the late 90s in Minnesota when the first charter law was passed.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the 19th century, chartering has been used in this country as a way to deliver education for a very long time. I'm thinking of the academies and the academy movement. There were thousands of academies that had permission, a charter from the state, to run a school. Now, did those academies pass the other measures of publicness? Not so much. But as a mechanism to promote schooling, we've been doing chartering for a long time. And I point that out because take somebody like Diane Ravitch. She's been on your show. She's a champion of district schools. She is a foe of privatization, but she knows that history. And she should be looking at our history to find different ways to promote public education.
Johnny Lupinacci, what do you think of that?
Well, I love it, Jonathan, because it helps. I think no good discussion has one side versus the other side. Like nothing good or real ever comes from that, right? I think it's, if we're drawing some Star Wars here, only Siths think an absolute, right? And so assuming that none of us are Sith lords or the Sith ilk, then we have this civic duty, especially as educators and advocates of that definition of public, Jonathan, that you gave, that resonates with me really strongly, especially as a Detroit teacher who sort of went through a real shift and change of what a neighborhood school looked like, and both certainly experienced exploitive charters and then some really great local neighborhood chartered schools that built on that tradition of university schools, of lab schools, and that as a very principle refused to be exclusionary. And
well, that's right, Johnny. Let me interrupt you for a second. When I was the authorizer in New York City, a lot of people that came to my office wanted the freedom to try something different.
Yeah.
They weren't competitive ideologues trying to put district schools out of business. And they picked up the chartering mechanism to do it. Yeah. Not unlike the way the small school advocates, Debbie Meyer and Ted Sizer, did small schools in the 80s.
Yep. I love that, Jonathan. And we're going to dive back into that when we come back. Callers, you can give us a call if you want to. We are here, 855-752-4842. Join us when we come back.
So we definitely got Joanne on the line. I haven't seen if we're gonna get another call to line up. So when we come back, though, let's get right to Joanne. Joanne calls quite regularly. She's a University of Wisconsin professor. So she's great. She has great questions. Loves the show. So good friend. But and that whole too, that Johnny too, when you talk about, the great, when a charter school, or Jonathan, when you talk about, people came into your office in New York City, not as this idea to create a school to, degrade the local public school. It was because they wanted to try something, and it when people say, well, aren't you talking about a magnet school? Is is that a good contrast? Because I'm going to bet that some people are going, are they talking about magnet schools?
Yeah. This is public listeners too, Jonathan. This behind the scenes, when it says we'll be right back, sort of takes our faces off. But if folks are listening, and some do, on YouTube or through Twitter, they get this sort of behind the scenes bit. So we are still essentially live.
Great.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, so we, during these times, so we, if you happen to be watching on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, then they get a little extra there by hearing us talk like that. But
Yeah, and if you think it's worth it to your listeners to go into the magnet district charter, a magnet is still a creature, so to speak, of government. It isn't constituted as a separate nonprofit entity like charters are. That creates different autonomies. And back to our theme here, how do you make sure governance is public, whether it's a magnet or a
And so, yeah, Jonathan, that was going to be one of the things because some of the other kind of like, okay, is it a public school, a public charter school that is under the guidance of a locally elected school board? That's a public charter school. A charter school that is not under a local elected school board, is that a public school?
Yeah, you want to go into that when we're back?
Yeah,
Great.
Yeah, I think that, because I definitely know, and I'm probably more on the side of saying I like charter schools as long as they're under the direction of an elected school board, because theoretically the elected school board are people of that community. And so again, from a democratic standpoint, that Johnny,
isn't that a district school?
Well, I know. I mean, Jonathan's, complicating my brain a little bit right now.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Well, a little scramble.
Jeez, I thought I knew everything.
Little scramble. No, I appreciate it, Jonathan. And really, Tim, in the book, there's a really good, in class, we sort of discussed this, like, wow, man. So it sort of opened this dialogue around, like, so what kinds of schools are there? Like, how do we have an accountability system to like Jonathan had said, to this, like, what does it mean to be public? And the easiest, I always talk in my class teaching, I call them street definitions. The easiest, like, let's break it down as simple as we can. Public school, like non-exclusionary, free at the point of access, and ought to be high quality. And we know that they're not all high quality, but in the attempts to bring that quality.
Yep. Now I'll push on that, Johnny, because if a voucher makes a private religious school free at the point of access, it doesn't pass.
That's right.
It doesn't pass the other definitions of exclusion around. Is it based on facts or faith? Is it is governance, right? So there's more to the access.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, man.
But if a private school met all of those tests of publicness, but operated via voucher in the way Christopher Jenks was advocating, in the 70s, feels like it's public.
Yep.
Oh man, scrambling our brains, darn it.
It's kind of in this segment too. We can take us into where you really kind of call in for funding, governance, accountability, et cetera, right? And to get into that, what's the purpose of schools?
Yeah, let's do it, because that governance is key, because I'm not sure school boards are as non-exclusionary, even if they're democratically elected.
There it is. It's Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Educated educators talking education. And yes, the best bumper music of any talk radio out there in the nation. You know it. People are listening going, hey, Tim and Johnny, why don't you just let the song play and then start talking? Well, hey, check it out. The Busted Pencil soundtrack. Something we could do. Anya and Jesse, if we put together a Busted Pencil soundtrack for people so they can check it out.
Playlist.
Yeah, playlist. Jonathan.
Kids these days call them playlists.
I'm sorry. Yeah. You mean they don't put it on a cassette tape and
I mean, that's coming back too, though. Like the analog always makes its way back. But
Tim, if you want to make me a mixtape, I'll take it from you, Tim.
I was going to say, thank you, Jonathan. A mixtape. That's what we used to play down in the basement of the fraternity house. Jonathan Gurko is our guest. His book, Publicization, talking about it. And we were saying behind the scenes during the break, getting our brains scrambled a little bit because Yeah, man. Well, I thought I knew what I was talking about, and Jonathan is potentially stirring up my brain, making me move in a direction where I'm kind of feeling uncomfortable, but that's okay. However, we've got Joanne on the line. Joanne, what's happening, our friend?
Great show. I just have a question about accountability and transparency when we're dealing with the difference between public schools and charter schools. The author paints a really rosy picture of some of the early days of charter schools and good intentions and stuff like that. But what we're not seeing is the accountability and transparency that makes public schools so effective. We can look right in there and see what's going on, and almost to a fault, almost to the point at which those public schools have so many examinations and so much accountability that they're tied down. So again, that very important word, accountability. How does that relate to this concept that the author's trying to get across?
Thank you, Joanne. Jonathan.
Yeah, Joanne, so nice. I've heard you on previous episodes and love your questions and love your passion. First, I take a very critical lens to how accountability has been construed in American education. There's a whole chapter on accountability. I think it's way too top down, and it's not mutual. And by way of a little story, I've been running a professional development company for the past 10 years. And, I had to unlearn my public sector ways and learn some private sector ways, which was when a new idea comes up, we say, well, can we resource this? Do we have the resources to do this, or what resources would it take, or is this farther down on the roadmap? And I share that in that particular way because I think a lot of it is asked of schools, but we don't pause to ask the question, have we resourced this? And in the book, you'll find a lot of advocacy for the notion of mutual accountability. It's what other folks have written about, that unless the state, government, family, community are going to uphold their ends of the accountability bargain, let's calibrate what schools can be held accountable to do based on what they're resourced to do. So that's generally on accountability. Look, on the charter district question of accountability and transparency, I read a lot of more of the popular political debate around charters. And it's almost as if charters have, like Athena, have been birthed from the head of Zeus and sort of exist freely in the wild. When in fact, we all know, they have to be authorized by a public body. And I'm not aware of those public bodies being elected. They could be, and that could be a future of chartering. But if they're appointed by public officials. So that's an opportunity to hold authorizers accountability for the oversight they're doing. It's an opportunity to elect leaders who have a point of view about authorizing and what charters can and can't do. And at least in New York, and I think nationally, charter board meetings are open to the public by law. And in my course in politics and at a teacher's college at Columbia, one of the requirements is go to a meeting. Unless we're going to exercise the mechanisms of democratic accountability, sure, it can seem unaccountable. And Joanne, you're right. I've been, and I say it in the book, in way too many charter school board meetings, held way up at the top of a Midtown skyscraper, office of some board member, totally exclusionary, fails the exclusion test, not at the school, at a time when parents, the public, concerned citizens can attend. But that's also a practical thing that can change as part of a publicization project to make charters more public, as opposed to just saying, let's get rid of charters.
BustED Pencils, fully leaded education talk, educated educators talking education, 855-752-4842. Yeah, our guest, Jonathan Gerko. Publicization is the book, and the complicated definition. We started the show with Jonathan. Tell us what you're talking about. Here we are into the third segment and going like, wow, it's complicated. It's tricky. I put, though, question in the chat for the people behind who are looking at this. Jonathan, though, okay, but if we're going to complicate potentially public, right? And that's okay because I'm working with it. But do we do so, though, at the point of then emboldening privatizers to say, see, they don't even know what they're talking about in public schools. This is why we need private education.
Yeah, look, this is why I wrote the book. I think we are in between intellectual tides, I think, and I hope neoliberalism is going out to sea. But we need language. We need a framework so that we're crisp on what we mean when we talk about a public education, so we can advocate for it, build policies, build practices around it. And I call that a publicization project, sort of the replacement, the successor to the privatization project. You are absolutely right, Tim. There are people in America, it's a democracy, we have a lot of different points of view, who would like tax dollars to support private interests, the private interests of a family, of a community, perhaps it's a faith-based community, what have you. They are unlikely to be brought into a publicization project. My hope and my intent in writing the book was to paint a broad enough ecumenical, pardon the pun, picture to bring more people into this notion of let's pursue the publicness of education regardless of the type. That is a stronger lobby and more in keeping with American traditions of schools preparing citizens, workers, good neighbors, and stewards of the planet.
Well, and there you're talking about too the idea, this kind of concerned, active, participating citizen, and realizing that the function of schools, while being quote academic, is that actually too that commitment to civicness, to democracy.
Well, but that's a choice. I quote Hannah Arendt, the famous political philosopher, towards the end of the book. The right to have rights is by no means certain. I'm paraphrasing her. What a public education means in America is by no means certain. And we live in a democracy, as the phenomenal political philosopher Danielle Allen writes. The only reason why we need democracy is because we have different interests. But it requires us to be in dialogue, to persuade others that schooling that overcomes our private interests, to start defining and shaping and preparing people for what we can agree are our common interests, that those are not only schools worth having, we actually need them for a democracy. Otherwise, it's a very different picture of schooling, where schooling just supports the particular private interests of families and children. That's a legitimate way to organize schools. I don't think it works to sustain a democracy.
Lupinacci.
Yeah, Tim, I love this. Jonathan, thanks for being on the show. I mean, we'll have you for a little bit longer, but this is really clear and really helpful to the messy argument about publicization. I love it. I love coming together in a unifying way to say, hey, let's have this discussion, but let's also have a movement around what does it mean to strengthen our education system and really get back to what is the purpose of schools. I'm going to take a little right turn here on things, because there's also some stuff happening at Civic Media that I want to get out here. Civic Media is deep in it with what they call Scotty Summers statewide. Text to Win contest is on now. Listen throughout the day for a chance to hear the next code to text in for a chance to win. New keywords are announced at the top of the 7, 9, and 11 a.m. and then the 1, 3, and 5, and 7 p.m. hours. Tune in and text in for a chance to win. Prizes include Wisconsin Dells prize packs, Milwaukee Brewers club level tickets, plus the chance to win a Scotty Summer staycation. Chances to win are every weekday from June 3rd to the 14th, beginning at 7 a.m. and right through to the 7 p.m. hour. Be sure to download the free Civic Media app in the Google Play or App Store and get ready to text in your chance to win in this statewide contest weekdays until Friday, June 14th. Man, whew. So lots of opportunities for our listener out there to, win some cool stuff and support Civic Media. But Jonathan, too, lots of rich stuff. This is just a sneak peek into the conversation that Publicization, your book, invites us to. And I think it's a really great read, especially listener out there who's involved in these conversations in your community. Jonathan, where can listener out there learn more, and tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, so while we're getting in promos, I will shamelessly promote. Right now, listeners can go to the Teachers College Press website. They are offering a discount through the end of this month until June 30th with the promotional code NHETC. That stands for the National Higher Education Teaching Conference, which my organization is leading this month in Minneapolis. And it's an opportunity where we're strengthening the quality of college education so that we can sustain the good work of K-12 educators. So that's that discount code NHETC at Teachers College Press through June 30th.
Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. So we got a little bit of time here too. I just see one of the texts coming in from Pat in Watertown. Please discuss any difference between charter and parochial schools. Jonathan, before you go.
Yeah, so charter schools are creatures of state law. And to my knowledge, every state law, with the exception of Oklahoma, and this is a really important development in the past 12 months, every state law dictates that the charter school must be non-denominational. So whereas a parochial school can express its privateness in all sorts of ways, right? You have to be admitted. You can be you can be denied admission. You have to pay. Even with a scholarship, there's always the potential you'll have to pay. Charters, by comparison, by law, non-denominational, free, funded by tax dollars, may not charge above and beyond that tax support, and may not deny anybody admission is by lottery. Oklahoma is pushing the boundaries because just recently, the Public Chartering Authority, so these are democratically elected leaders, authorized a Catholic charter school.
Whoa, that is pushing boundaries.
Pushing the boundaries. Our guest, Jonathan Gerko, thank you for busting pencils with us, man. Appreciate it. We got to get on that Oklahoma one. Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Tim and Johnny break it down next. Goes fast, Jonathan, doesn't it?
Love it. Love it.
Excellent.
Look,
Excellent.
I'll do this every night with you guys if you want.
Hey, we appreciate it because, man, we just got into that. I'm so glad you touched on that because, looking at now he got himself. I was reading a news story where it looks like he's starting to get a little bit of some pushback from the Oklahoma Republicans now. The state superintendent there who's really pushed for this.
Well, that's right. It's in violation with the federal regulations to be eligible for federal support for charters.
30 seconds.
That has to be non-denominational. And if the superintendent's getting in trouble, isn't that the democratic process working itself out?
20 seconds.
Yeah, it is.
Jonathan, are you sticking around for our last segment?
Happy to. I'll sit in silence and happy to listen because I want to get that screenshot.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
The screen, though.
Let's just have them on for the last one, too. Let's do it.
Sure,
Thanks.
why not?
Right?
Why not?
All right. Stick around then.
Party.
There it is. School's out, seven dust, busted pencils, fully leaded education talk, educated educators talking education. The number 855-752-4842. Jonathan Gerko, our guest, he hasn't busted enough pencils. We decided, hey, Jonathan, you want to hang out for the last segment? We got more pencils to bust here because you just started getting into this idea. You know, Pat from Watertown, who put in the question, the difference between charter and parochial, and you were really going into parochial and this kind of what's happening in Oklahoma. And you know, just again, kind of because I really pushed you on that to kind of sum it up. Give us a little bit more about what's going on in Oklahoma with parochial and public, and help us figure it out.
Yeah. So as I said before we went into the break, the democratically elected or appointed board of charter authorizers in the state approved a charter for a Catholic organization to run a faith-based school. Going back to my book, that fails the measures of publicness, right? And Johnny, to your point, I think this is where the book can be helpful. What do we mean public? Well, here are some criteria, and this is clearly, and this is why we oppose this action because of X, Y, and Z. How does it fail the exclusion test? If I don't want a Catholic education, I may not go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There may be a free lottery, but students may not apply. So on and so forth. Tim, you taught me that the state superintendent may be getting some pushback internally for approving this school. And by the way, it was a split decision by the state charter authorizing board. Isn't that, Tim, an example of our democracy working?
Yeah.
That we're actually voicing what we want and expect of our schools, and there will be political consequences. So far from Joanne's question, there's no accountability here. Superintendent might lose his job. And if he doesn't, maybe the people of Oklahoma are okay with it.
Yeah, he didn't put his name out there. Ryan Walters, you know, state superintendent of public instruction in Oklahoma. Well, I mean, he's pushing it out there and trying to get this forward, and, you know, using Jonathan's book, Publicization, and say the exclusionary test. I'm sorry, but in Oklahoma, you know, if we're using this, you know, a much more inclusive definition of public that Jonathan gives us here, a state voucher and then the authorization of a Catholic school by the state that's going to be exclusionary, yeah, that's not public, even though it's going to fall under the charter definition. And we said the complications of charter being there. Johnny Lupinacci, you got the look of going like, man, I got something more to say.
Well, no, I mean, just taking this in and grateful for Jonathan to stick around for the last segment and be with us to keep busting pencils here, because there's a lot to chew on here. There's some really good stuff around this, and I want to loop back around that one of the things this does bring us back to, and I think it's a necessary part of this political moment that we're in as a nation, is coming back around to just asking that simple but complicated question: what's the purpose of schools, and how does it fit together with our vision, our shared vision, which might be a messy one, but our shared vision of what we want that purpose to be, right? And Jonathan puts in the chat here, like, what does it mean to be an educated American, right? And how do we determine that? I mean, we can ask AI, right, Tim?
Yeah, we can.
Really, how do we want to get into that? And before we even wrap up, though, I do want to say, you know, one place you can do that is you can have really awesome conversations down at the Minocqua Brewing Company, where Busted Pencils is sponsored by the Minocqua Brewing Company, who sued the state of Wisconsin to end parasitic voucher system that hurt the public schools, right? Minocqua Brewing Company is making Wisconsin great again, one beer at a time. Check out MinocquaBrewingCompany.com to see where you can buy their progressive beer. But, you know, that brings us back around to this call, right? And this concept. Jonathan, I'm going to put you on the spot. We had a great conversation tonight. Publicization. Is it a verb? Is it a noun? Is it all of these things? I definitely think it's an invitation to get some work done.
Yeah, look, 40 years ago, nobody said the word privatization.
Yeah.
Now it rolls off the tongue and everybody knows exactly what it means. Let's co-construct that definition together. And I've put out a thesis as to what it means, but this is America. It is a democracy. We need many voices in this definition and in the work. So bring it. I welcome it.
I
Busted
love it.
pencils.
Yep.
Yeah. Fully leaded education talk, educated educators talking education. Great guest for the whole entire episode, Jonathan Gerko. His book, Publicization, Teachers College Press is where you can get it. We'll have that actually too for anybody downloading the show as a podcast. We'll have a link to that to make sure that people can actually go and get the book and start having those, kind of book reading sessions at home, book clubs, and bring that together and start having this conversation. Because if you are a public advocate, Jonathan, putting forward here that exclusionary test, I think that too is a really nice way to help going. Is it public? Is it not public? And well, here are some ways that we can possibly enter and say, here's a test. Here's a, so, okay, you want to be classified public? Okay, tell us this. What do you do for that? How do you do this? Oh, you do say that certain kids can't get in because, okay, well then, sorry, that's not, because that's part of the exclusion test. Jonathan, I saw or Johnny or Jonathan, whoever.
It just put it out there. I love your invitation, Jonathan. We're learners leading learners, and listener out there, you're a learner leading learners. You're always learning. And Jonathan, I'm learning from publicization. I'm here for it. Tim and I are reading it. We're talking about it with our students and getting to talk about it with you and our listeners. I think we're going to have a follow-up. So listener, get the book, give it a read, dive in, and let's have Jonathan back on and let's talk some more as learners leading learners.
Learners leading learners. And I love that too. In fact, for the next show, we could even do this, Jonathan, if you're up for it. You said you would love to come back. Is that, we can have guests come in and say, okay, is this public? Bring you out there, listener, bring us your examples of what you think are public, and let's put it through. Let's have an episode where we go through the exclusionary test that Jonathan puts forth in the book, Busted Pen or Publicization. Our show is Busted Pencils, Fully Leaded Education Talk. Jonathan, man, truly, and out here, thank you so much for busting pencils. Everybody, tomorrow night, Educators Amplified. See y'all tomorrow.
Skills of dominating.